Dr. Sharifah, Yang Berbahagia Dato' Guru Samin, Yang Berbahagia Datin Halimah, who has just left, Prof. Farida, and Prof. Imawati. Dato', Tuan-Tuan dan Puan-Puan, ladies and gentlemen, a very good morning to all of you. First of all, let me say what a great pleasure and a great honor it is to be invited here today on behalf of the Ministry of Natural Resources and Environment to provide a little bit of background, perhaps, to this issue of environment management here in Malaysia. I've been seconded to the Ministry of Natural Resources and Environment. I currently work in the Division of Environment Management and Climate Change. Now, let me see if I can get this somewhere. Here we go. Okay. I'll talk a little bit about, first of all, some national and international policy frameworks, how we can harmonize these, and then I'll move a little bit to some of what we're actually doing in terms of the carbon inventory of the country. I may have to cross over some of these slides because of the time, but what I'd really like to get through is to some of the initiatives that are being taken by Malaysia. Finally, some thoughts on what are some key challenges, not just for Malaysia, but for Malaysia in the context of the global effort to address climate change and other environmental issues, and try and end on a positive note on how we might possibly move forward. Okay, Malaysia is, as we know, the king of making policies. We are very good at making policies, and in my ministry alone, we have all these policies. Now, if you add KETA, you can add a few other policies to that. And then we've got all the associated acts and regulations for these policies. Some implemented to a better degree and some to a lesser degree. But nonetheless, these are what we have to work with, these are what we have to deal with, and we have to view them in the framework of the international frameworks. Now, the big thing that came out of the original Rio summit was the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change and its legally binding instrument, the Kyoto Protocol. We also had the Biodiversity Convention with CITES and Ramsar flowing from that. Now we have an international timber trade agreement that's hosted by ITO. The UN Convention on Desertification also came out from Rio. We also have, I'm very happy to say, addressed to a great degree the ozone problem through the Montreal Protocol on ozone depleting substances. In my ministry also, we are in charge of the Rotterdam Convention, which is the one on hazardous chemicals, and the Basel Convention, which is the one on waste, and we have signed and ratified all of these conventions. The Stockholm Convention on persistent organic pollutants we have signed, but we have not yet ratified. And if you want, I'll get into why that is, if you'd like. But once again, I need to spend more time on the presentation. We also have several upcoming conventions, instruments on mercury and several types of heavy metals, all of which we consider as very important, as these are relevant for Malaysia's environment as well. Right? Apart from these multinational environmental agreements, we are also very much into regional agreements. Among these important ones are the East Asia Network for Acid Deposition, the ASEAN Transboundary Haze Agreement, and some others. Right? We also have bilateral agreements. For example, through the free trade agreement with New Zealand, we have an environmental cooperation agreement. So we have these multilateral things, we have regional things that are very quite important. Actually, in fact, ENET is instrumental in bringing us our real-time air quality monitoring. It's also enabled us to view online the hotspots in all of ASEAN, and helps to put pressure where necessary on countries that do not prevent open burning from occurring. Okay? So, all of these have their scope, which we have to contend with. We have their legal nature, some are legally binding, some are not. They have implementation cost. Now, some of these conventions, the cost is borne by Malaysia itself, others is borne by the developed countries who help us with it. And then finally, there are compliance implications for those that are legally binding. So all these things come with a certain amount of responsibility, a certain amount of institutional arrangements that need to be made, set up, and of course everyone needs to earn a budget. Right. Now the problem with Malaysia is harmonizing existing policies and then looking at existing policies in the context of all the international policies. The Green Revolution came and went. Our young friend was very eloquent in talking about this. The sustainability revolution, which was at its peak around Rio, also came and went. It wasn't glamorous enough, not sexy enough, and now we have the climate change revolution, which is driving all these things. Is it any different from the first two initiatives? Actually, no. It's not. It's the same things, but we've repackaged it in a way that can help keep the interest, to keep the focus on it for a longer period of time, we hope. All right? We used to talk about sustainable growth, and then we realized that therein was a complication. You cannot grow, you cannot grow, continue to grow in a situation where resources are finite. So we then talked about sustainable development, and I thought, that's okay, but even then you cannot continue to develop ad infinitum. All right? So I thought to myself, okay, sustainability is it. We're going to talk about sustainability now, and that's untouchable. And then throughout the negotiations, I learned that even sustainability is tarnished, because if you think about the World Bank and the Asian Development Bank and all these other banks, okay, their idea of sustainability is to keep developing countries in debt so that they can continue to earn interest income. All right? So even the word sustainability now, you've got to put it in the right context when you talk about these things. All right. So national policy harmonization, for example, harmonizing a national transportation policy with an automotive policy, for example. Okay? Harmonizing our own policies with multilateral environmental agreements is very important. And then increasing the importance of transboundary issues. This is one thing where we actually, in smaller groups, in regional groups, in sub-regional groups, actually can make a lot of progress. The choices: lead, follow, or just stand on the sidelines and observe. Okay? Very clear cut. Now, just as an example, one of the ways in which I think Malaysia is taking the lead among ASEAN countries, in some ways, and in some ways among countries in the world as well, including developed countries, is actually in announcing we have a target. This is our GHG inventory from the Second National Communication, and this is the pledge that was made. This is among, by the way, one of the most frequently misquoted and misunderstood statements, all right? So we've got to read it very carefully, we've got to read it in terms, but we've made a voluntary indicator. We've adopted a voluntary indicator to reduce emissions intensity of GDP by up to 40% based on 2005 levels, intensity levels, by 2020, conditional on receipt of assistance from developed countries, financial assistance, and technology transfer. All right? There are a lot of conditions there, but these conditions are important because they take us back to the Convention on Climate Change, the principles of that convention, which actually recognize the historical emissions of developed countries and therefore allocate responsibility accordingly to developed countries as opposed to developing countries. This is what we intend to do. We intend to reduce our intensity from 0.6 to 0.373 by 2020. What does this mean in real terms? I've got actually a pamphlet out because it's so misunderstood. I put a pamphlet out, a little threefold thing that helps people to understand. Essentially, you look at emissions divided by the GDP. That gives you the intensity. The lower intensity, the more the country is succeeding at decoupling development from emissions. The idea is to end up sort of like, for example, Denmark, where development can continue, GDP can continue to increase, but the level of emissions remains constant. All right. To help us, we have the National Climate Change Policy. We've got a renewable energy efficiency, solid waste management plan under the 10th Malaysia Plan. Some of the initiatives by KETA, the voluntary, the Green Technology Financing Scheme, some voluntary carbon offset schemes involving corporate private companies. We also now have a low carbon cities framework, I believe just launched yesterday, the LCCF, by KETA. We're also developing, to support this 40% pledge, intensity pledge, a long-term roadmap. This is spearheaded by NRE. We are collaborating with University Tenaga Malaysia and Rajendra Pachauri's Terry Institute in India. We've, the roadmap, final roadmap is due out in the third quarter of this year. inception report came out at the end of last year, and we're looking forward to this because we cannot wait to begin implementing it. These are the potential mitigations. I won't spend a lot of time on this slide. It's quite technical, but we have the Climate Change and Green Technology Council, Green Technology Climate Change Council, to try to take this roadmap and make it a reality. In this slide it says 7 working groups. We're actually up to 8 working groups now. And we're actually going to have the first meeting this year of this council, I think, in the month of June. All right? So, how are we hoping to pull this off? Well, we're hoping to put all these initiatives to work. Officers no cooler than 24 degrees. We've already got 5-star purchase rebates. The Green Building Index already is more than 100 buildings provisionally. Well, no, it's about 40 to 50 buildings provisionally certified, more than 100 buildings in the pipeline. Okay, we've got the National Automobile Company testing hybrids and full electric vehicles. Something that is very exciting and very interesting to me, post-consumer edible oil recycling for biodiesel production. And the good thing about this is it does 2 very important things. It takes away the oil supply from illegal cooking oil recyclers that are recycling for cooking oil, and it provides a source of biodiesel that is not in competition with edible oils, which is the problem that has always been faced by the oil palm industry. We are continuing to accelerate tree planting together with Jabatan Lanskap. We have SIRIM looking at an eco-labeling program. The Renewable Energy Act is finally working, and we hope to increase the percentage, not just the 1% that you see on your bill. And finally, we've removed the import and excise duty exemption for hybrids vehicles. All right? And we hope that companies will continue to introduce new hybrid models, and that the take-up will continue to increase in Malaysia. As far as some early results, we already have about 5.4 million tons of CO2 equivalent accounted for just by companies announcing the kinds of emissions reductions that they themselves are pledging to do. All right? In terms of renewable energy, the use of oil palm mesocarp in mills to generate steam electricity already replaces fossil fuels to the tune of 19 million tons carbon dioxide equivalent a year. And I'm very happy to say paper recycling is actually over 80%. All right? If you contact the Association of Paper Manufacturers, get the names of the top 20 companies, call them and ask them how much post-consumer content they're using in their cartons, in their boxes. You will see that it's equivalent of 6.18 million tons a year. And this is not from all the companies. I haven't finished going through the companies yet. Okay? So we want to move to a knowledge-based economy. We want the private sector to take the lead. Dato' is actually absolutely correct. The tripod on which this must stand is government, the private sector, and civil society, or the general public. Okay? We want the general public to drive it. We want the public to tell the private sector what they want, and then we will enable it. Okay? The market will also dictate the pace. So the sooner you begin demanding green products, the sooner the private sector will respond. Okay? And finally, we're looking at improvements in physical infrastructure, in ICT infrastructure, the greening of ICT, greening by ICT, and a bunch of other initiatives. Now, what have we got in RM in the 2012 budget exactly? We've got about 100 million for these projects. Okay, we're looking at the innovation in schools and public institutions. We've got the Malaysian Foundation for Innovation involved. Cipta One Malaysia Awards. We're growing a culture of innovation through even reality programs. Good heavens. These are quote unquote my least favorite program, because once you put a camera there, it no longer is reality. Okay? And finally, we're looking at things like market validation funds. Okay? We're looking at angel entrepreneur assistance for green types of programs, and a bunch of others. Okay, here are some others. We want to give design services pioneer status, and we are also organizing the World Innovation Forum. Okay? Now, the idea is to actually begin forming a local and endogenous pool of intellectual property. The issue with technology transfer is that foreign governments always tell us it's in the hands of the private sector. They hold the patents. We can't really do anything about that. But they actually have more control than they would let on, because they control patents that are of strategic importance to the country. Military patents, for example. If a private corporation wants to sell military technology overseas, the developed country can say, no, you can't do that. It's of strategic importance. Okay? And green economy and green development is the next big arena for strategic negotiations. Okay? So this is what I'm talking about. Indigenous intellectual property. Okay? Now, in the interest of time, I'd just like to scroll through what I think might be some challenges for us. All right? This green growth, green economy, green technology paradigm, to some extent assumes that we can, with the help of technology, grow ourselves out of the morass that we are now in. That we can develop ourselves out of this morass, spend ourselves out of this morass. But if you look at the Industrial Revolution, it took 125 years for us to get to this point, to grow our respective GDPs to the point where it is now. If we want to stay within the 2-degree pledge that Copenhagen gave us, we will have to almost completely reverse the paradigm in a space of 20 to 30 years. If you think about the Kyoto Protocol, it took 5 years to negotiate and 8 years to come into force. All right? What we have actually pledged to do in Durban, for the Durban platform for enhanced implementation, is to actually come up with a binding agreement in 3 years and to have it come into force in 5 years. So 5, 8, 3, 5. And recall that for the Kyoto Protocol, we had to divide the emissions reductions commitments among 40 or so developed countries of the world. For the Durban platform, we will have to divide the emissions among almost 200 countries, developing countries included, as well as developed countries. All right? So, are we being overly ambitious in trying to achieve this? How much can we ourselves bring to bear? And I'll talk about some more challenges, some of the component challenges, as it were. Every time we make progress into a new technology, achieve some kind of new efficiency, we always have a rebound effect. If our cars are more efficient, we drive them more. We go further, we take more trips. Okay? What can we do about outsourcing? Whether it's developed countries outsourcing emissions to developing countries in the form of some kind of a demand. All right? One of the first things that developed countries did before they signed the Kyoto Protocol is they moved all the high emission industries offshore in the name of overseas aid. Okay?
Foreign direct investment.
Foreign development assistance.
Foreign direct investment.
So what are we going to do now? They are still importing a huge bunch. If you look at a report that just came out from UNCTAD, it's got an amazing graph that combines the imports versus the outports, the imports versus the export emissions of countries. Key countries like Japan, China, US, Canada, and others. All right? How do we deal with the present energy demand mix? We can probably move to renewables on stationary sources, but what about our mobile sources? We are still very much, apart from electricity rail, okay, we're still rely heavily on fossil fuels. Okay? Can we get beyond the linear thinking that is prevalent in our society today? We always think, can we make cars more efficient? Can we make them hybrids? Can we make them completely electric vehicles without considering perhaps that we may have to move completely beyond cars in the first place? Okay? Can we address some of the issues where we move to new technologies like hybrids, where we actually place more demand on rare earths? And we actually might be promoting accelerated extraction in developing countries because developed countries might have more stringent requirements in terms of the environmental impact. Okay? How do we get beyond the on-the-way syndrome? The fact that once we begin an action, we can say, sort of sit back on our laurels and say, well, we're almost there, we're taking action, we've put these policies in place, we've put an action plan into place, a roadmap. What do we do about the almost there syndrome? Systems that are 99.95% complete, but that last bit prevents it from working completely. Okay? One example I'll give, I'm very clear about this, Nadi Putra. They've got the buses, they've got the drivers, they've got the gas, they've got the timetables, they've got smart announcement boards at every bus stop. What we don't have is buses that come and go when the signboard says they come and go. Alright? What more do we need to spend on? Watches for the drivers? I don't know what. I don't know. We have 99.9, everything is there. We just have to have a KPI, perhaps. Okay? So, is this becoming an issue where we are faced with a trilemma that is save humanity, perhaps at our own cost? In other words, we take all the advanced action, we take the lead, but we lose out to other countries. Save Malaysia? Do we make sure that Malaysia remains competitive at all costs? So we actually slow ourselves down perhaps environmentally? Or do we save ourselves and say, you know, Malaysia will be fine. We can let everything else go to hell in a handbasket. But we know that environmental issues do not respect national boundaries. Okay? And they are completely governed by physics, by chemistry, and by biology. You cannot run away from that. Okay? So, our only hope is transparency moving forward. The more transparency we have in everything, in government, in economic management, in environment management, in planning, the better, and the more we will be looked upon by other countries as having the kind of attitude that it takes to move in the right direction. Because what consumers, your households demand, governments will endorse, and industry will supply. Thank you.
Thank you, Gary. It was so interesting, so rewarding to hear to your speech. But now the mic, I think the mic is now.
I will repeat the question. Yeah, his name is Jason. But I can hear you.
I'm also a member of the Bantar Utama Residents Association, and I had the privilege to study and live in Australia for 3 years, and sort of sadly, actually Malaysians are the least civic-minded when it comes to taking care of the environment. In Australia, I used to pour out the yellow beans every day and differentiate the recycled and non-recycled. And when I come back to Malaysia, I realized that the systems have not been in place to do that, and I myself have been guilty of just dumping the recyclables into the bins. I'm just wondering, regarding great budget, great initiatives, but down to the rakyat level, what has the government planned to do? And has this been something the government has been doing, or has there just been a lack of awareness, or something, there's some big roadmap coming up in the future? Happy to know. Thank you.
Please, Gary.
Thank you, Jason. The answer is yes. Okay. I'm sure many of you have also lived overseas, and you also understand the problems associated with it. As a matter of fact, we have had a Waste Management Act since quite a while ago. And the issue is getting that act implemented due to existing contractual arrangements. Right? So every time a contract ends, that is when we need to step in and turn around and say, okay, no more business as usual, let us make this act move. Now, I think it was last year that the act was supposed to begin implemented in April. We were then told in the news that no, it's going to be put off until 2017. And then later on we were told, no, it's in September. Okay? So information is a problem in Malaysia. Information is a problem, flip-flops is a problem, getting the right information, the right source is a problem. But I'm very happy to note that we are working very closely with KPKT, who is in charge of this, okay? Kementerian Perumahan dan Kerajaan Tempatan, and the JP Jabatan Sisa Pekerja Negara, okay, to begin moving this in the right direction. In the interim, we have waste management systems like the one being run by core competencies in Semenyi that take everything from the Kajang area that actually manage to recycle 80% of the rubbish and use the remainder to generate about 9.5 megawatts of electricity, 5 of which is used by the plant and 4.5 of which is sold back to the grid. I'll be able to talk to you more about that later if you want.
Thank you, Gary. We'll be there. One more question. I saw two hands, both from gentlemen. All right, I'll give to my neighbor. I was sitting there just now. Please. I think you can be.
The mic will come to you.
Thank you very much. My name is Theseira Abdul Karim. I'm a one-man NGO trying to change people to become better, that's all. Just a simple one. You know, we all have a lot of rubbish to throw away anywhere. But say we come to a public, say LRT station. I have some rubbish to throw away, but I don't see any dustbins. So where do I throw this away? So this is a problem, you know. Many places where you need to throw rubbish and there's no littering signs and all that, but there's no dustbins. That's all. Thank you very much.
Gary, do you have the answer for
I have
it?
a very, very brief answer. I used to also think that dustbins were the answer. But if you go to Tokyo, you will not see dustbins. And the reason is that people teach their children to take their rubbish home with them, where it is sorted into the correct bin. Thank you.
Thank you very much.